Want to book a ticket straight back to 1875. It looks incredible, and it is almost entirely a lie. Because the real Wild West Saloon was something dramatically, hilariously, and sometimes horrifyingly different from the Hollywood version. It was louder, darker, smellier, more violent, more chaotic, and more human than any film has ever managed to capture. And today, we are pulling back every curtain, lifting every floorboard, and telling you the unfiltered, unvarnished, genuinely dirty truth. So let's start right at the entrance, because even before you set foot inside, the real saloon was already telling you something important. The famous swinging half doors, called batwing doors, were actually not present in many frontier saloons, especially in the colder northern and mountain territories, where a half door in January would simply be a way to guarantee that everyone inside froze to death. Many saloons had solid, heavy doors, sometimes with no windows at all, which meant that the moment you stepped inside, you moved from bright sunlight into a smoky, eye-watering dimness that took several minutes to adjust to. And that smoke, let's talk about that smoke. Every man in the room was almost certainly smoking, either a pipe, a hand-rolled cigarette made from cheap tobacco, or a cigar if he was feeling wealthy. The ceilings were low, ventilation was essentially non-existent, and the combined output of 30 or 40 smokers in an enclosed space created an atmosphere that was less romantic frontier haze and more, you genuinely cannot breathe properly. Your eyes would be streaming within minutes. Your clothes would absorb the smell so completely that it would take days to wash out. And the walls, if you looked closely, which you probably shouldn't, were coated in a thick layer of yellowish-brown residue that represented years of accumulated tobacco smoke. Let's get to the floor, because the floor of the real Wild West Saloon deserves its own chapter in the history of human disgust. Most saloon floors were bare wooden boards, no carpet, no tile, nothing that could be easily cleaned. And those boards were the recipients of everything that a room full of drinking, spitting, tobacco-chewing frontiermen could produce over the course of an evening. Sawdust was spread across the floor in most establishments, and its primary purpose was not decoration. It was to absorb spilled beer, spilled whiskey, tobacco spit, blood, vomit, and anything else that found its way off the bar or out of a patron's body. The sawdust was replaced periodically, but periodically, in a busy frontier saloon, could mean once a week, or once every 2 weeks, depending on how industrious or how indifferent the proprietor happened to be. By the end of a long Saturday night, that sawdust was a compacted, reeking mat of human byproducts that crunched unpleasantly under your boots and released a smell that even the most hardened frontier nose would notice. And here is the detail that truly seals it. Spittoons, the brass bowls placed around the room for men to spit their tobacco juice into, were present in every saloon, but actually hitting them was apparently considered optional by a significant portion of the clientele. Frontier etiquette around spitting was, to put it diplomatically, relaxed. Men chewed tobacco constantly, and the floor received the majority of the output regardless of where the spittoons were positioned. Some establishments kept a dog specifically to clean up food scraps and other unmentionables from the floor between shifts. And in certain saloons, this was genuinely considered a hygiene upgrade. Let's move to the bar itself, because the bar counter is where the mythology of the Wild West is most violently separated from the reality. The whiskey, which we touched on in a previous video, was frequently adulterated, diluted, or outright dangerous, but the glasses it was served in deserve special attention. Glassware was expensive on the frontier, breakage was constant, and washing facilities were primitive at best. In many saloons, a glass was washed by being dunked briefly in a bucket of water that sat under the bar all day and was replaced, if you were lucky, once per shift. By the end of the evening, that water was essentially a thin soup of whiskey residue, tobacco juice, and the germs of every man who had drunk from those glasses since noon. Some bartenders didn't bother with the bucket at all. and simply wiped the glass on their apron before refilling it. An apron that had already absorbed the contents of several previous accidents during the course of the day. The bar counter itself was wiped down occasionally with a damp rag, but wiped down and cleaned were not the same thing, and the sticky, permanently tacky surface of a busy saloon bar was a fixture that patrons simply accepted as part of the experience. You put your hands on that bar at your own risk, and most people just didn't think about it. Now let's talk about something that the movies absolutely never show you: the smell. We have already covered tobacco smoke and sawdust, but the full olfactory experience of a real frontier saloon went several layers deeper than that. Bathing on the frontier was not a daily activity, or even for many cowboys and miners, a weekly one. A cattle drive could last for weeks or months, with no bathing facilities available except the occasional creek. And by the time a crew rode into town, they had been living in their clothes in extreme physical conditions for a very long time. Room full of men who had not bathed in weeks, who had been working in dust and heat and livestock, who were now sweating freely in enclosed space heated by a wood stove. The smell was something that contemporary accounts describe with a frankness that is almost poetic in its horror. One journalist visiting a Kansas cattle town in the 1870s wrote that stepping into a saloon at the height of the cattle season was an experience that assaulted every sense simultaneously and left a man questioning his decision to enter. And yet, everyone entered anyway, because the alternative was being outside, alone, with nowhere to sit and nothing to drink. Let's talk about the violence now, because the real violence of the frontier saloon was nothing like the choreographed showdowns of the Western genre. Real saloon violence was sudden, messy, and disproportionate. It erupted without warning from arguments over cards, over women, over perceived slights that would seem trivial to an outside observer. And it rarely resolved itself in a clean, two-man duel with a clear winner. Most saloon fights involved multiple participants, furniture, bottles, and whatever else came to hand. And they ended not with a dignified victor walking out into the sunset, but with several bleeding, bruised men being thrown into the street by a bartender who was large enough to enforce some minimal standard of order. Guns were absolutely present in saloons, despite the efforts of some town ordinances to prohibit them. And gunshot wounds were treated by whoever happened to have the most relevant experience, which might be the local doctor if the town was large enough to have one, or might be a bartender with a bottle of whiskey and a steady hand. Deaths in saloons were not rare, and legal consequences for killing a man in a frontier saloon were deeply inconsistent, depending on the town, the sheriff, the reputation of the dead man, and the mood of whatever passed for a judicial system in that particular location. And now, the beds. Because many saloons also functioned as hotels, and the sleeping arrangements above or behind the barroom floor were, if anything, even grimmer than the barroom itself. Bedbugs were not an occasional problem in frontier lodgings. They were a near universal fixture, so accepted and so omnipresent that travelers' journals of the period mention them with the same resigned matter-of-factness as they mention the weather. Sheets were changed infrequently. Mattresses were stuffed with hay or corn husks that compressed and molded over time, and the thin walls between sleeping rooms meant that privacy was a concept rather than a reality. Ice were also a constant companion of frontier life, spread freely in the close quarters of shared sleeping spaces, and a man who arrived at a saloon clean and louse-free had a very reasonable chance of not remaining that way after a single night in the rooms above the bar. The frontier was, in the most literal possible sense, an itchy place, and the saloon was its itchiest venue. And yet, and this is the part that makes all of this genuinely fascinating, rather than simply repulsive, people loved these places, loved them desperately, passionately, and with a loyalty that makes complete sense the moment you understand the context. The frontier was lonely, in a way that is almost impossible to convey to a modern audience surrounded by screens, communication, and constant human contact. A cowboy on a cattle drive, a miner in a mountain camp, a homesteader on the plains. These people could go weeks or months with meaningful human interaction reduced to a bare minimum, with nothing to look at but empty landscape, and nothing to listen to but wind. And then they came to town, and there was the saloon, dirty and loud and smelly and dangerous, and it was full of people, full of noise, full of life. The filth was real. The danger was real. The whiskey was genuinely terrible, and the floor was an ongoing public health crisis. But none of that mattered when you were sitting at that sticky bar with a glass in your hand, your elbow touching another human being's elbow, the sound of 30 voices filling the air around you. The dirty truth about the Wild West Saloon is not just that it was dirty. It is that people needed it anyway, that the human hunger for connection and community is so powerful and